Welcome to Rich Conversations. Today we'll chat with Remington Tonar about cities. This is a super interesting conversation, and I wish we actually had more time to discuss it. You can follow Remington at Remington Tonar. Let's begin. All right, so we have Rem Tonar here with us, and we've been thinking about cities, and we actually had a conversation like this probably like a month ago, and we were like, hey, we should start recording our conversations when we chat. So this is kind of like a second conversation on what we talked about with cities earlier. And in the meantime, I read the book Triumph of the City by Edward Glaser.
Edward Glaser.
And then I'm about halfway through Jeffrey West's book Scale. I had to return to the library, so then now I had to buy it on paperback. So I got to pick that up. But very interesting books, and we both have lived in urban areas, cities, basically our entire adult lives. And living in Chicago, one of the biggest things is, since reading Triumph of the City, I now walk around the city differently.
Yeah.
And because I think the biggest point I think from this book is affordable housing.
Yeah. He talks a lot about affordable housing in there, and almost every book on urban living or urban policy is going to dwell, at least for a period, on affordable housing, right? Because affordability is a big issue in cities. And, you hear a lot of controversy around things like gentrification. All of that is related to affordable housing, right? Gentrification is only controversial because it drives up the prices in a neighborhood, thereby driving out the previous residents of the neighborhood. If the neighborhood would stay affordable, you'd have very diverse and heterogeneous, like non-homogeneous, very mixed and dynamic neighborhoods, rather than the homogeneity that gentrification often brings with it, which so many people decry, except for the landlords. They love it because they make a lot of money, either in their ability to raise rent or sell their properties at a much higher multiple than they would have been able to otherwise. Affordable housing is big on the residential side, but also just affordability in commercial real estate as well, right?
Yeah.
You need businesses, restaurants. The restaurant business has such thin margins to begin with. A lot of that is rent. The rent for a restaurant is very high because you have to cover your kitchen and you have to cover your front of house. And so there's a lot of spatial costs to owning a restaurant or any business, any retail business. So, affordability is really important for dynamic neighborhoods, but there are no easy ways to ensure affordability without artificially manipulating markets, which then will always have kind of unintentional outcome.
Yeah.
Many times, which can be more negative than unaffordability.
Reading this book, the two cities that we live in, Houston and Chicago, get mentioned quite a bit. And this book was written in 2010, so obviously 10 years happened and things are a little different. But I would say Houston is still one of the most highly moved to area in the country. And they also talk about New York City and Paris, two places.
Chicago is one of the fastest shrinking cities in the country.
Illinois is shrinking.
Chicago is shrinking. I mean, there are cities that are shrinking faster than Chicago, right? But not top 5 cities, right? All the other top 5 cities are either holding steady or growing. Chicago is the only one that's is in the top 5 that's actively shrinking. But a lot of that's kind of people moving to the suburbs. But then increasingly a lot of those people are just moving out of Illinois.
In particular to the Sunbelt areas.
Into the Sunbelt, right?
Where you have a lot of suburban sprawl.
Right. Well, and so I've lived in 4 cities now: Milwaukee, Chicago, New York, and Houston. And so that's 3 out of the top 5 largest cities in the country. Interestingly, they say Houston is going to pass Chicago to be the 3rd largest city in the country in the next, 5 years or something. Estimates vary, but that seems.
Yeah, I can believe that. You also have this large geographical area.
That's right. The city of Houston is also larger than some states, so that helps as well.
Yeah.
It's something like, I don't know, you could look it up, folks, but it's like 660 square miles or something in area that Houston is. You can fit like all of Chicago, all of Seattle, all of St. Louis, all of New York City, and like all of Boston in the square mileage of the city of Houston. It's obscene.
Yeah.
Relatively low density to those other major cities. But what's interesting about the cities in Texas is that Austin's about to enter the top 10. So Texas is now going to have 4 of the top 10 largest cities in the country.
So what do you, besides weather, what do you contribute?
Affordability. No, but this is why it's relevant, right? Because land here, because we have so darn much of it, is highly affordable. You can have a massive house with a big pool and as big of a yard as you want for the price of studio in Manhattan. So the affordability is hugely beneficial. And yes, that means that you have to drive a lot more because things get spread out. But because they're spread out, you can go downtown Houston and get a really nice high-rise apartment with a balcony, also very affordably, because the demand for that particular unit is much lower because a good portion of the population wants to live in the neighborhoods with big yards and pools. So the diffusion of density reduces or smooths out demand over a larger geographical area, which decreases the price. And so the affordability is absolutely the driver of growth in these cities. Now, Austin is a little more expensive, but it's
a little bit more trendy.
More
cool
trendy
Texas city.
It's cool. It's younger, right? It's younger and very kind of has a little hipster vibe. Some might call it a city of yuppies, but definitely known to be a cooler or more culturally adventurous, let's call it, city. The most culturally adventurous city in Texas, without a doubt. And but people are still moving there mainly because it offers a great combination of those cultural experiences, but also affordability, right? And so the combination of those two things is what's catapulting Austin into the top 10.
Talk about why you have lived in cities, why you love cities.
Yeah, well, cities have this ineffable magic about them that is really driven by the tremendous amount of difference and diversity, dynamism, and serendipity that they have to offer. In New York, you can discover something new and different and interesting and intriguing around every corner or with every person you talk to. And everybody you talk to has an interesting story and interesting experiences that you can learn from that open up the world to you. Every restaurant has the same. Every street has history. And, there's just so much narrative and mystique to being able to constantly discover something new, learn something new, meet new interesting people that are different than the next by and large. That goes away after a while. There's an author, Joan Didion, who wrote an essay about leaving New York that's very famous now, Goodbye to All That it's called, or I think originally it was titled Goodbye to the Emerald City, as it appeared in the Saturday Post. I think it's in the 60s. But she talks about how after a while there are no new faces in New York because even though you're still meeting new people, they're the same X number of types of people. So not even New York is infallible in that regard. But that said, you can discover a lot more about people, places, and things in New York than you can in other cities, right, that are more homogenous, where every person kind of has the same background, kind of went to the same schools, kind of does the same thing, or works in the same industries, has the same interests, and ultimately, isn't really worldly, right? One of my criticisms about the culture in Houston is because it's been so driven by the energy industry, the oil and gas industry, right? Everyone you meet is like, oh yeah, I'm an oil field engineer. I went to Texas A&M. and I live in this neighborhood, right? And that's like that's like a good bulk of the professional population. Well,
Yeah.
what's the fun in that? You're not learning anything new. You're not meeting new people. It's just clones of the same person. That's very frustrating.
So when we talk about like creating the future and innovation and exchange of ideas, cities have been kind of they've been the epicenter of a lot of these things. What happens then, say post-COVID, when people are maybe spreading out a little bit more? Then what happens and how do these ideas happen if everybody's not so close living together?
Yeah, it's a good question. I think one thing I would say is hopefully the diffusion of that creative capacity will actually help small to mid-sized cities see a renaissance, right? Like
Oh,
Oklahoma City could use some of those folks. Omaha, Nebraska could use some of those folks, right?
yeah,
Columbus, Ohio, well, they have OSU, they have Ohio State there, but Cleveland could probably use some of those folks, wherever. So a lot of the
yeah.
mid-continent, mid-America, middle market, second tier cities hopefully will benefit by the diffusion of that brain power. The other thing is that even though they're leaving places with like a high density of those folks, the kind of downside of density is competition, right? Like you
Okay.
have more competition for your ideas because there's a tremendous number of really creative and smart people all around you, right? So it's
Hmm.
harder to stand out in that environment. Whereas in an Oklahoma City, you might be the leading authority. Like Rich, you could probably be the leading authority in Oklahoma City on like Joseph Albers, right? Having no like formal art degree.
I,
uh, Seriously, like
I'd
it's not
say
it's
be in
not
the
even
top
a
five.
yeah, I know. It's like, but but in Chicago or New York or LA, right? It's like you'll run into people with masters of fine arts degrees, on every block who are experts, like subject matter experts in these types of things, right? So there's a lot more competition. Competition can be good, right? It can drive people to kind of perform better, learn more, reach higher. So competition does have its benefits. Competition of ideas in kind of highly dense cities like New York, but I think on the other hand, that prevents kind of more equitable human flourishing, that can be had if these people were allowed to really challenge themselves in other places.
One of the big points in the book was transportation and human capital and transportation. A lot of cities make the mistake of investing in buildings rather than people. And so, let's build this new building. Let's build this new train that
Wow,
will go around the
this is a
city. And
great topic.
it's like, it's about people. People drive the world, not buildings.
Yeah,
So it's
absolutely.
about like investment in people and then improving the transportation so that you do get more people involved.
Yeah. So this is one of my favorite topics of discussion. The smart cities industry is huge right now, and every city has smart city initiatives, and they're trying to digitalize and digitize their cities and connect all of the traffic signals, to real-time data, to optimize traffic flow, or put smart concrete into the highways to figure out flood patterns and repair patterns, all this kind of stuff, right? But
Yeah.
the problem is what people forget is that smart cities aren't built by smart things; they're built by smart people. you
Yeah.
know. To have a truly smart city, you need smart, empowered citizens, right? And this, Rich, but for your listeners, so I write for Forbes on smart cities and infrastructure. So I think about these particular topics a lot and have taken to task very publicly some of the organizations like Google subsidiary Sidewalk Labs for their blunders in this area. Sidewalk Labs is a consulting firm that is owned entirely by Google that was founded to help cities essentially digitalize and automate and become quote unquote smart cities. And they were doing a huge project, very public and got a lot of press project with the city of Toronto. And they published this, 1,000-page report on their plans for Toronto, right? And people had a lot of problems of it because it was more about collecting data on people than it was about helping people. And I did just like a quick like keyword analysis of the document of the report. And the word citizen in the entire report is mentioned something like, I can't remember the exact number, but it was like 2 or 3 times. Okay.
That's it?
Yeah. The word autonomous vehicle or autonomous car or some derivation thereof was mentioned 600 or 700 times. Right. So it just shows you where their priorities were. They cared more about turning Toronto or this particular district
a Google friendly place.
Yeah, into like a really cool tech forward neighborhood, but never really took into account how does this help people, and what do the people want, and what do the people need, right? So there's a very famous 20th century urban theorist named Jane Jacobs, and I think,
Jane.
Yeah, Jane, yeah, and Glazer probably mentions her a number of times.
Oh, a number of times.
Okay, good, yeah.
The Death and Life of Great American Cities.
The Death and Life of Great American Cities by Jane Jacobs. Glazer talks about her. Richard Florida talks about her. Pretty much anyone who's in the urban theory or urban studies world will talk about Jane Jacobs at some point in anything they write because of how seminal she was, and she's really the kind of mother of urban studies, if you will, and she actually prevented Robert Moses, right, the big urban planner Robert Moses, from dropping a highway straight through the middle of Manhattan. So where Greenwich, where Washington Square Park is in Greenwich Village in Manhattan, that was going to be a highway if Robert Moses had his way, and Jane Jacobs like pretty much single-handedly put the kibosh on that. But her big thing was to really understand a city and what it needs and make it better. You have to walk the streets. You got to hit the streets. You got to get out there, and you got to like learn about the people who live in the cities, and it's less about like the buildings, the physical environment and the infrastructure of any city, like any network, because cities are just complex networks, right? They're complex systems that are made up of multiple individual agents and nodes that are interconnected through.
And that's where the book Scale comes into play.
Exactly right. Boom.
Talks about these, and then you.
Yep. Because
cities get bigger and bigger.
Yeah. Exactly, because cities, right, operate like any other or most other complex network or complex system, right? And they obey certain laws that are intrinsic to nature about what happens to them at scale and the challenges and opportunities they encounter as they scale. And so if you want to understand like how to make a city better, you also have to understand physics and scale, etc., because all these things come into play. But the physical environment, the buildings, the roads, the infrastructure, that stuff's super important. Infrastructure and mobility are vital, right? Because it's the infrastructure that connects people to things and people to people, right? By moving either people or goods or services from A to B, whether that's electricity, water, human beings. So these things are extremely important. But your, high-speed train is not going to help a city if the entire city has an IQ of 50. Yeah. Are you moving bodies or are you moving humans, right? And it's like if you want to move humans, those humans have to have individual agency, feel empowered to be actors within their own city, right? And to make decisions that will improve their own lives and the lives of those around them. And that takes more than just physical infrastructure. It takes social infrastructure, economic infrastructure, educational infrastructure. All of these things need to be tied in with the physical infrastructure, right? Like we should learn where we live and socialize where we work and improve our lives economically as we are moving around a city. Like all of these things need to be thought of as an interconnected system where every piece of the system impacts all the other parts to some degree or another. And a lot of people don't look at it that way. They see cities as very linear, right? There's buildings going up and there's roads going across, right?
Yeah.
If you're mapping your city based on the buildings and the roads and not the movement of people, you're already making a mistake, because studies have shown, done by MIT and others, on London especially, there's a seminal study that was done, I think, with Orange Telecom, which is a big telco over there, on how people move in cities. And there's the von Thunen standard model of how to arrange a city, which is concentric circles, right? Where it's like the business districts in the center, and then people live around that, and then there's like, farms on the outside and all this stuff.
Right.
Well, like that's actually not how people interact with cities, right? If you look at the actual data, it's very jagged. There's like, hubs and nodes, and then like branches and different kind of micro networks that like spin off out of those nodes. It's not linear. It's not concentric circles, right? It's much more like it looks much more like a neural network in the brain than it does, some neat, tidy set of circles or grids that we might design. So we have to stop thinking of our cities as like these neatly laid out, highly planned kind of physical structures, and start seeing them as, the complex systems and phenomena that they are, which takes a different set of tools to understand and improve.
What do you think is a good way for people to better understand the cities that they live in, or the cities that are closest to them and are kind of like the hub of the region?
Yeah, well, you said region. Region's also like a trigger word in urban studies, right? Because there's this whole set of theories on regionalism and how, maybe the future may be regional. If you think about all these outlying suburbs or even like kind of rural areas that are on the outskirts of cities, right? An hour, 2 hours outside of the city center. A lot of those neighborhoods, or not regions, areas, cities, towns, villages are struggling now, right? A lot of them are shrinking and not economically flourishing. But imagine if we could, and this is where physical infrastructure does come into play, imagine if we could connect the farmland, the hinterlands, right, with the urban centers, so that you could, what is now a 2-hour drive could be a 10 or 15 minute either quadcopter flight or, Hyperloop trip, right? What if you could get from, rural Delavan, whatever, Wisconsin to Milwaukee or, Chicago in like 10 minutes, 15 minutes, right?
Yeah.
That's game changing, because people might choose to congregate in cities for work and play, but live where there's more land, in a more leisurely lifestyle. So the opportunities with regionalism and to create interconnected regions and move people and ideas back and forth from these different physical assets, right? Whether it be countryside or suburbs or urban, is a huge opportunity that I think we're going to need to exploit to unlock the next wave of urban economic growth in America. So I think all of those areas around cities have a huge role to play. We just have to figure out how they can play that role in an efficient fashion.
Yeah, that's something we talked about last time. Usually there was this talk of mega cities. That's where everything's going, is these big, giant mega cities across the U.S. And we talked about this was during COVID. And now what does that look like when maybe people decide to live out further? And then we talked about, instead of measuring in distance, we should measure in time. Maybe elaborate on that idea. You kind of hinted at it at the last point you were making.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, I mean, what people are really trying to save isn't distance, it's time, right?
Yeah.
Like, why don't you, go, where would you go? Where would you want to go? I mean, why, it's like if you're living on the north side of Chicago, let's say you go to Northwestern and you live in Evanston, Illinois. Why don't you go down to University of Chicago and Hyde Park more often, and do like, collaborate with students down there? Well, it's a hike. That's far. Yeah. It's like you get on I don't know what takes you down there, Red Line maybe, like, however you get down there, like the 151 Express down Lakeshore or whatever.
You have to, whatever you do, you have to like transfer a bunch of different times unless you have a car, and even that's like a half hour.
Then you'll hit traffic, and that hit traffic, you'll be a nightmare. You get stuck on Lakeshore Drive, or but it's not the distance, right? In fact, that's not really far. It's not that far. Hyde Park is not that far away from Evanston, right? But time-wise, it is far, right? Same thing in New York. It's like New York is tiny geographically, tiny, right? But if the 6 breaks down or the 4-5 Express breaks down, and you're trying to get from the Upper East Side, down to Union Square, forget about it. You're taking a 30-minute walk or so, so, but what you care about really is the time thing. That is what we need to solve for. We need to conquer time, not distance. Now, the easiest way, or really the only way we know to conquer time, is to conquer distance, right? Because distance often contributes to time, but so does traffic. Yeah. Right. And so does kind of inadequate infrastructure. Obstacles, if you have to go around something, that contributes to time, even if it doesn't add that much distance. So the we need to figure out ways to conquer time. Yes, that can be done through conquering distance, but it can also be done through technology. And this is where technology does come into play. Like, technology is important to help solving these problems, because technology can take the same distance and accelerate or reduce the amount of time it takes to travel that distance. So technology absolutely has a role to play. But, again, we need to make sure that we are conquering the time challenge in a way that actually creates value for humans, for people, rather than just like shortening travel time for the sake of shortening travel time, right? We need to make sure that the people who we're shortening travel time for need their travel time shortened. It's like a lot of cities like, oh, well, where do the people live? The people live here, and we're going to make it easier for those people to get to like Michigan Avenue in Chicago, where all the shopping is, right? Okay, well, do the folks who are going down to Michigan Avenue to shop, at like Saks or, wherever, do they really need, that travel time? Is that travel time that valuable to them? Or could that travel time like fundamentally transform a lower income community by giving them the ability to get more places to work faster? Right. Yeah. Or even to get places where they could get better jobs at all. They might not even be able to get to those places now. Right. That adds so much more value to those individuals, and therefore to the city as a whole, if we focus on, kind of solving those issues for those populations. But, the first thing is always, let's focus on what people see, and people want, a beautiful Michigan Avenue with great transit options. Well, that doesn't really help most of Chicagoans.
Yeah, absolutely. A lot of people you talk to, they talk about how they would like the red line to extend further, and, the lack of transportation options in the areas.
Yeah, but the people who say that, I mean, like, think of this. There's plenty of lower income, underserved community neighborhoods in Chicago, right, that just wish they'd have a line at all.
Yeah. I mean, a lot of these lines too were developed years ago, and so if you're not naturally by those spots, then like, it's super hard to get around, because then you have to own a car, and then now it's more traffic, and it's more time.
Yep. It's more time. And then it's like, because people want to be near the hubs or the stops, right? Now the real estate in those areas becomes more expensive, right? So now it's like, this is happening in LA. LA Metro is going on a huge construction and development kick, which is awesome. That city needs it. But if you look at what's happening everywhere where they're putting a new stop, condos, like high rise, expensive condos are just popping up, right? Because everyone's going to want to live next to this new, metro stop. Okay, well, the people who really need that metro stop can't afford those condos.
So how do you deal with that? How do you control?
Well, unfortunately, like, a lot of this is political, right?
Yeah.
People, whether you're a Democrat or a Republican, let me tell you, it does you well to, make sure that the college kids from DePaul, can get downtown quickly and back. You know what I mean? It's like, it's just politically expedient to care for the people that fund your campaign, the groups of people or the types of people that fund your campaign, and it's economically kind of untenable in some ways to want to put a metro line or any type of public transit into certain neighborhoods, right? Because those neighborhoods just might not have the ability to pay the fare, or might not want to pay the fare, right? So, or you might have to lower the fare to get good ridership, and maybe there's concern that they won't treat the infrastructure as well, and you'll end up spending a lot more in repair and cleaning and those sorts of things. But those are all things that we can come up with solutions for, creative solutions for. What we can't do is we can't just give up on whole neighborhoods, But these aren't easy issues. And they're not easy because anytime you try to initiate a change in a city, because it's a complex system, it affects other parts of the system, right?
Yeah.
And then, and the government, is frankly always behind. Look how long New York just got its Second Avenue subway line a few years ago. That thing has been in the works for like 70 years. It's like they came up with that. They wanted to put that in for a long time, but never had the political will to do so. And then, they're extending other lines, but like, you're always going to be behind, because cities, what they do is they use historical data to try to predict future population shifts, right?
Okay.
But and this is what a lot of people do in prediction. They use historical data. Yeah, but there's an
But
inherent
that was a
problem.
different story. That was a different time ago.
Yeah, I know. That's the inherent problem of using historical data to predict future events. The historical data absolutely, like in many cases, has absolutely nothing to do with the future, right? I mean, if you just look at historical data, agnostic of events like COVID, for example,
Mm-hmm.
the historical data is going to tell a very different story than the future data, right?
Yeah.
And the historical data, especially with an event like COVID isn't going to help you predict much of anything. It's not going to be useful for prediction in most cases. So, we have to find better models of prediction. People are like, well, how do you do that? All we have is historical data, but that's not all you have. And this is where the walk the streets thing and Jane Jacobs
Yeah.
come to play. It's ethnography. You got to get out there and talk to people. You got to get your pulse. You got to get the pulse.
Gotta get the vibe.
What's the vibe of what's happening out there, what people are thinking, what their hopes and dreams are, how those hopes and dreams are changing, what they want to do, who they're talking with, right? I mean, like where they're spending their free time, where they want to shop, where they don't want to shop, right? Where they want to go to work, where they don't want to work. What are the employees at that person's work doing? Where do they go after work? Like, where do they hang out? Do they go right home? If they go right home, where are their kids? It's like you have to ask the hard questions that are more qualitative than quantitative, and like the government is not equipped to do that, right? But like those are the types of things you need to do to figure it out.
On data and history, right?
Because it's easy.
Yeah.
It's easy to, data you can look at and think and feel like you have a command of everything that's going on from one graphic or data set, right? But that doesn't tell you why those things are happening or who the data points are, right? Or what they're going to do next, right? It tells you none of that, right? It's much harder to actually go and try to talk to the people.
So this kind of bleeds into a conversation I had recently with someone. We were talking about local areas, say your city ward, and how often is it the alderman decides this is what I want and then projects it onto the neighborhood or the ward and goes fight for it for city council for a way to just attain a resume for a higher position of politics, rather than how often is it the actual people and community collectively coming together as like a coalition and saying, this is what we believe in, this is what we want, and then your city council member should just execute what you want rather than the other way around.
Yeah,
how often do you think that's the
like
case?
in like a real republic? Yeah, that's probably. I mean, I don't know. It depends from council person to council person, but the council people, aldermen, whatever the equivalent in your city is, they have agendas. They're politicians. They're elected officials, right? This is why I think like we need to radically decentralize how decisions in neighborhoods are made. It's the community should get a say, about
so
what to do. Like? Well, I mean, it's like it's groups, it's community groups, and kind of more decentralized, autonomous decision making, right? So, like if you're in a community and there's this like overrun lot that is owned by a bunch of property developers that refuse to do anything, and people do drug deals there and dump bodies there, whatever it is. And the city won't do anything about it because it's private property, that sort of thing. Yeah. But maybe it becomes a public nuisance, and then the city can kind of impose its will and demand that the property developer do something with it to make sure it's not a public nuisance, right? Yeah. Well, like the community really has no control over what that developer does or what happens to that land, right? Mm-hmm. Like the city has some influence, right? But if you live across the street, right, you have much less influence on what happens to that land than either the developer or property owner that lives in the rich neighborhood across town, or the politician that spends their time in city hall, right? So these people that do not live in your neighborhood don't have to look or deal with this dilapidated piece of land, have more control over what happens to it than you, the person who lives across the street, right? You should have a say in what happens to that. Maybe you think, because you've talked to all your neighbors, maybe you think it'd be great to put a really simple park there, for example, right? And it's like why can't you just make that a park? But the people are disempowered. The power in a lot of decisions in cities rests either with the politicians or with the property owners.
Power to the people.
Yeah, the people need to have more of a say in it, and property owners, the private sector needs to recognize that. Look, if you're on the property owner side and you want to eventually either develop that land or sell that land, that property will be much more valuable if you are helping to create a thriving neighborhood, right? If your land is allowing it to turn into a ghetto, right? Like, yeah, you're not going to be able to do anything profitable with that property, duh. So it's just like people need to get their head out of their ass and, recognize that, every decision affects, the entire community, and recognize that what's good for the community is good for them.
Something I've been thinking about lately is, so I've been living in the same apartment unit for 7 years in
awesome.
The neighborhood of North Center. And I'm kind of having like all these reflections and memories, and I'm getting a little emotional because I'm going to move into a new apartment on more the northeast side in Uptown. Asia and Argyle is kind of the area. So a lot of Vietnamese food right by the park. I'm living in a high rise instead, like an old high rise instead of like a walk up. So I'm just very curious how my experience of the city will now differ, and all of a sudden it's like how it will also be reinvigorated by the people and new types of people I'm going to interact with and restaurants, and it's such a cool thing to me to be in a city, and you can get all these different experiences in any area.
Yeah, wouldn't it be cool if there was like a more kind of long-term Airbnb where you could spend like 6 months to a year in one apartment and then go to another, and the property owner, their landlord, wouldn't have to worry because there'd be someone else that would like come over and take over that lease, but for a very short period of time. But they're all part of the same platform or program where they're like cycling through different neighborhoods of a city. Like, that'd be kind of cool.
It's interesting. I don't know if that was like a big issue with Airbnb and
well, you're going to talk about the laws, but this is another problem, right? It's like, why do those laws exist? Like, let people do what they want to do with their, it's like, just like get rid of the law. Property owners should recognize that this is actually a net benefit for them.
To have people come that want to be.
Yeah, and the city should recognize that it's a net benefit for them as well.
So what do you think about in Chicago, the word gentrification is a very dirty word, and so you have a lot of these neighborhoods. I mean,
gentrification is a dirty word everywhere.
Yeah, but everything isn't. The nature of life is change, and neighborhoods have always changed. Cities have always changed. People don't like change, and how do you maintain a culture and a sense of community when buildings are getting knocked down and generic buildings are going up and shutting down like family stores in the area?
Yeah, totally. Well, it's really tough, and optimally, I think you'd have a good mix of all of those different elements. You would have kind of young professionals living alongside someone whose family has lived in that neighborhood for 2 generations, 3 generations, right, and maybe or maybe folks who would come over as immigrants. So optimally, I think you want a diversity of different types of people in your neighborhood. I think the economics just are such that it drives out the folks who were there first. In my old neighborhood in Brooklyn, you used to see stuff like this. You probably won't be able to see this, but where's my build community, not condos. Yeah, like just graffiti down the sidewalks, and there's like this one, like gentrification is the new colonialism.
Oh yeah, that sounds like someone in Brooklyn would.
Yeah, you'll like this one. This was another one that was real popular. Art for whom?
For whom? Interesting.
Yeah. And but these are the questions that are always asked and should be asked whenever a neighborhood is experiencing gentrification. You really can't stop gentrification, right? It's economics. But I think what needs to happen is, and again, it goes back to like a physical infrastructure component, right? If you have more places that are easily accessible and interconnected, it will give people more options because you'll diffuse the population, across a wider kind of swath of land, right? I mean, gentrification isn't really a huge deal in Houston because everything's so cheap to begin with. I mean, it does happen in Houston, but it's not nearly as dramatic as it is in Chicago or New York. But I mean, Chicago and New York have limitations, intrinsic, topological, like physical limitations.
Right.
You can't build east. You can't build east in Chicago, right?
Right.
You hit something.
Yeah.
And
Hit the water.
you can't build, kind of southeast in New York. You hit something else, the Atlantic Ocean, So, the port cities are hugely successful because they're port cities, because they're on water.
Mm-hmm.
But at the same time, it does limit your ability to develop kind of smoothly diffused cities, and so you get clumpiness. And then, if you don't have an intelligently and forward-looking designed public transit system, you get increased clumpiness and more clumpiness. And the clumpiness is kind of, those are the areas that you'll have affordability issues in,
Yeah.
How do you smooth out the clumps, And it's not that you necessarily want to smooth out the clump. You still want maybe hubs of activity, So it's like the dispersion of living, like housing inventory might look different than the dispersion of retail and shopping inventory and like office inventory. So each of these needs to have a life of its own and can't be overplanned. That said, you just have
you gotta let it happen more naturally.
You got to let it happen naturally, but you still have to work to open up opportunities so that people have somewhere to go after they've been driven out of their existing neighborhood. And the other element is like, I don't believe in rent control. I think rent control has an insidious effect, which is it just drives up prices overall because, you in New York, for example, there's like 1 million units on rent control, There's something crazy like that, right?
So
I mean, that has a material impact.
Leaving Manhattan for Brooklyn and then gentrifying Brooklyn, and people in Brooklyn
because they can't afford to live in Manhattan because you've taken like millions of units off the market, which drives up the prices, supply and demand, right?
And so New York too, they mentioned in the book that a lot of it is this is something I kind of changed. I've been like changing my mind because I love how all these different styles in the city. In Chicago, you have these old styles and units, and it's kind of romantic, and look at how old they are. But like say in New York, if everything is now preserved, now there's less opportunity to build up and build new. So then that means that there's not going to be as many units, and then the cost of living goes up.
Yep. Yeah. I mean, cities need to be multidimensional. They have to look up as much as they look out. And down in the South, people look out and across horizontally because there's just a lot of horizontal land. But like, places like Houston need to take a thing or two from the North and start building more up. But it's more expensive to build up. It's much cheaper to build kind of condos, or houses, 2-story houses, than it is to build a 50-story glass and steel high rise. So, the costs come into play. New York builds up because it has to. Houston doesn't build up because it doesn't have to, right? But and you don't want a very small cluster of very tall buildings like that. That's not good either.
Yeah.
So again, like the magic of cities is their diversity and dynamism and the ebb and flow and the tension and the push and pull. So the moment anyone says about a city, well, we can't have any of that, well, that's wrong. You need a little bit of everything.
Yeah. Well, on that note, any more last words about cities and their dynamic?
No, I don't know. I could talk about cities for a long time, but I'm glad you read Triumph of the City. Scale is awesome to understand how like the complexity and growth of cities actually parallels many different systems in nature, including the human brain and computer networks and animal life, the biosphere, etc. So that's super cool. But I mean, Jane Jacobs' Death and Life of Great American Cities is a must read. Josh Lerner, professor at Harvard, has a lot of good books. Richard Florida also has a lot of great work on cities. There's a lot of urbanists out there that are really. Carlo Ratti, who's not really, I guess he's into smart cities now. He's an MIT guy. But like all these people are really trying to think about cities through a different lens. And fortunately, many of them are much more anthropocentric or human-centered than say Sidewalk Labs and Google have been, and that's what we need, right? Ultimately, we can talk about building up, building out, walk-ups, high rises, infrastructure, trains, public transit. We can talk about this stuff all day. It's very interesting, and it's very, very, very important. But none of it matters unless we first unless we attend to and take care of the people that these things are meant to serve, and then build them and develop them in such a way where we can be sure that they will continue to serve people and the interests of communities.
So we need to ensure that thoughtful, intelligent people are able to communicate together and work collaboratively to ensure the future of a lot of our communities.
Yes, and we need, transformation or rethinking of how decisions in cities and in neighborhoods within those cities are made. And we need to do more work to empower people and involve people in ways that are deeper and more systemic than just town halls, right? The town hall is the answer for all these. Oh, we'll have a town hall. Yeah, well, okay. Just listening to people yell at you for a while, isn't that constructive, right? We need to fundamentally rethink the structure of how decisions are made and how data and information are gathered within cities to inform civic leaders on what decisions should be made, right?
Qualitative and quantitative.
Exactly. There needs to be more of that Jane Jacobs walking the streets. And if you start walking the streets, you start to see cities in a whole new way. Cities,
man. If residents don't feel empowered, then they're just going to let everything happen.
Well, exactly, but it's like a vicious cycle, right? It's like if you don't think you have a voice, you're not gonna speak out, right? And then no change happens. But I think the answer is, you need leaders from, I guess Barack Obama style community organizers. You need leaders from within the people to come forward with solutions that are pragmatic. I think one of the problems today is like the solutions like a lot of these civic activist groups come up with are like radical. It's like, well, you can't do that. You still have to work within like the system of laws and like the economics that we have. You know what I mean? It's like you can't like say, well, our neighborhood wants to start using only Bitcoin. It's like, okay, man, like it's like enough of this. Come up with like some real solutions. But I have a couple good ones. I think that like the food deserts are a big problem, right? In lower income neighborhoods and cities, people can't get access to good food, and the cheap food that like Walmart, whoever's hawking out, is like horrible. It's not good for you. So I actually think that every neighborhood in major cities should have its own vertical farm that is kind of run by a PPP, a private public partnership, and has a full-time staff and is responsible for producing in a vertical farm, so highly controlled environment, enough produce every season to feed, to like supply X amount to everyone in that neighborhood, right? And so you have these like micro kind of decentralized vertical urban farms that can grow a tremendous amount of produce because they're vertical farms, so they're highly optimized and efficient. And you can really solve food desert problems that way. And you have someone deliver it, maybe like the milkman, or maybe there's a little autonomous vehicle that like, moves brings you your carrots or whatever. I don't know. But, like stuff like that. I think decentralization is the answer, where neighborhoods can be self-sufficient and neighborhoods can empower their own, so the idea of the city may be too monolithic for its own good. I think we might need to think smaller,
that's
not bigger, but smaller,
Interesting.
But yeah, no, cities are a great topic. But I do think the key to solving the problems in cities is not to think bigger, but to think smaller. It's interesting. But I think it's about hyperlocality. It's about decentralization. It's about empowering tribes, neighborhoods, groups, communities. And because look, globally, institutions are under fire. People don't like big, nobody likes like these institutions, whether they're big corporations or governments. Like people are anti-institution. People want to cluster up with like minds. They want to find their tribe and just like be, and we should enable people to do that.
I agree. I love it. Well, thanks for joining me, Rem. I appreciate it.
Always glad to be here.
Thanks for listening to Rich Conversations. Again, you can follow Remington at Remington Tonar. Take some time today, or the next few days, to observe life around you like Jane Jacobs. Have an awesome day.